Brad, so good
And
to see you. Thank you for joining us.
pleasure is mine. Good to see you as well with all the awards. It's very exciting there.
Appreciate it. Some of them are due to you, pal, so thank you.
You're too kind.
So, would you begin by just introducing yourself and your company?
Sure. So I work at a law firm. It's a top 100 law firm. We're based in Philadelphia, but have 30 offices, a full service law firm. I My focus is on development. So I tend to represent owners, sponsors, developers that buy land, build buildings. They also buy buildings and adaptively reuse them. So I help them in that endeavor. I help them get them financed. I help them with incentives, both federal and state incentives, including like the Inflation Reduction Act and the Build Back Better Act, and state sort of equivalents. And I spend some time working on, affordable housing for special needs adults. And I also spend a bunch of time on the quixotic journey of, trying to convince some developer types that sustainability and energy efficiency and water conservation are appropriate, good, for not only their buildings, but for kind of writ large, the environment, and why that's relevant to them. So it depends on the day, but we're doing all that on any particular day.
Well, thank you. I know you're really good at that stuff, and I appreciate you being with us today. Can you briefly share your major takeaways from what the SEC is requiring?
The SEC, again, big picture, they're focusing on company. We're not telling you if it's material or not. We're telling you you need to make a determination on whether it's material, it being, climate disclosure. And if it is, you then need to disclose in a certain way kind of what those impacts are to not only the company, but the financial statements. Are you going to be reporting? If so, what can we do to be helpful so that we are prepared for being able to give you this information? So, what information is material to you, company? What's germane to you? So, pick your biggest 10 companies because they could get impacted and then you would get impacted. So, what do I mean by that? So, the SEC, as we just talked about, they're not requiring scope three, they're not requiring supply chain. That doesn't mean that it ends there. So, because certain states have gotten frustrated with the federal government over time, one state in particular, not surprisingly, California, who tends to be at the bleeding edge of kind of climate, yes, and also of kind of environmental rules. California got sick of waiting for all intents and purposes, and so at the end of 23, passed three bills. One of which one requires companies in California to report their risk-based analysis of what climate change creates by way of risk to their operations in California. So everybody's got to do that in California. So you got to be paying attention. Companies in California that have done 500 million and a billion. So there's like 5,300 companies that have done $500 million worth of business. There's another 1,500 companies that have done over $1 billion. And these are times. So, meaning the disclosure of risks is in effect for 2024. It will probably slide to 2025, but 2024. The $500 million, company impact is in 2025, and the $1 billion impact is in 2026. Those companies in California that are doing business over 500 million and over a billion are required to, as of 25, 26, or 26, 27, required to report not only scope one and two, like the SEC said, but you're required to report scope three. So, anybody that's doing business, deep to your point, with California based companies that are at that close to 500 or close to a billion, they're not going to take a risk. They're going to say we're in until told otherwise. You are in our supply chain. You need to tell us what's your greenhouse gas impact because we need to use that information in determining what's material to us. And Mr. or Miss Company, it could be small company, it could be big company, it could be medium. If you can't tell us, it's not that we don't love you, it's not that we don't like you. We can't afford to wait for you because we are required to report to the state. And if we don't, we get fined. And those fines add up. And so, yes, the SEC took scope 3 out, not relevant for the moment, not relevant for a couple of years at least. But if you're doing business with companies that do business in California, which is like the 9th largest economy in the world, you might get swept in anyway because the rules are going to sweep in scope 3. Okay, so you got to be paying attention to where do the companies that I provide services to or goods to, where do they operate? Now, again, if they're operating in California, you will have gotten a survey already asking you questions. And so that's a sit down with people or a Zoom call or, Teams, whatever, to find out, like, what is it you really need? How quickly do you need it? How can I be helpful? Or you're going to get, unfortunately, left because they don't have time to talk to 1,000 people to educate them on, what we're talking about.
There's a lot in there.
Yeah. In particular, again, California's not going to, so right now, that's California. They're not going to be the only one to do that. I mean, there's going to be other states that will likely follow their lead. My guess is that they'll be mostly East Coast states. But for the moment, it's California. You got to keep your eye on those, as I said earlier, the sands continue to shift. Other states may follow California's lead and, start to push on this just as hard. The SEC, if it ever changed its rule to include scope 3, that would sort of pull you right back in as well. So it behooves people to start to measure, monitor, and figure out a verification system so that they're not scrambling when it comes to these questionnaires and they have a system already in place to make that happen.
Referring back to what the SEC is doing, they simply recognize that there are investors and other stakeholders who just are looking for more information so that they can make an informed decision, right? The SEC is not forcing people to change business practices, to do any of these things. It's just to provide additional information beyond the standardized financial reporting so that those investors and others who care about, if they're in an area where there's going to be hurricanes or floods, that it may affect where they buy or where they invest. And the same thing relative to the cleaning industry. There will be investors and building owners and other customers who are looking for more information, not merely just what is the cost per square foot or the cost for a gallon of all-purpose cleaner, but will want to know more about who they're buying from, all these other issues to reduce the risk that perhaps they won't have half their cleaners show up, or the increase in fuels will have a detrimental impact on delivery costs of products, or will jack up the cost of plastic materials and those kind of things. So it's just getting to the information to make more informed decisions.
I think that's spot on. That clearly, so you heard it. That is the takeaway, which is it's not every investor has to care about this. It's many were asking. We're going to hopefully give it to them to allow them to decide how important it is or not important in making their more informed decisions on where to invest their money. And so you sort of say, well, look, I can decide to invest in a hurricane-ridden area or not. That's up to me. But the more information I have about, well, what has that property owner done in that area? Are they being thoughtful about like where their mechanical equipment is? Do they have insurance to cover this? How much? If there's a flood event, what would happen and what's their plan? The more the investor understands about that, the more they feel comfortable or not with respect to a particular owner and what their plans are. And that's, again, to your point, that's exactly, the SEC is not saying you have to do this. They're saying it's up to you to decide and your investors whether they want this information and whether it's material. If it's material, you have to disclose it. It's up to them to decide whether they care or don't. And some people are asking, not everywhere, not every town, but some people are asking, and more people are asking over time. And so, to your point, it's a lens to review data from. It's not the only lens, and they're not saying you have to look at it. They're saying, we think that this is relatively important for most ordinary, reasonable, prudent investors. We're not saying that every single one has to. We're not saying that it's going to be important to every company. Because if you own in a particular area that doesn't have floods, fires, hurricanes, weather events, God bless you. But if you're living in there and you make the informed decision that, hey, we've looked at all this information, we have a system to review this and look at it, and our board has this level of impact, and our senior management does this and has this expertise, we don't think it's material, but we've got all this in place. Then that would, again, inform the investor as to what they've done or not done, and whether their decision that it's not material is appropriate. That's where it'll get kind of interesting over time.
Thank you. Last question for you, pal.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot. Any final thoughts? Anything else you'd like to share?
So I hope the Phillies win over 100 games, number one. Number two, I do think, as you know, so I do a monthly call on sustainability where I bring in experts like you and others to talk about different topics. And, strange, odd people tune in and they listen, and, I don't know what the hell they're doing, but they're tuning in. And I think I want to leave the folks that listen in on your stuff with the following, which is, again, I don't think it's like a, kind of star chamber. I don't think we're talking to each other to just hear each other. It's possible. So it's possible, but it's a guard against that, but it's possible. But I do feel like over the last 2.5 years when I've been hosting these calls, the amount of guests, so I typically have 3 or 4 guests on, the amount of guests that have said that people, John Q. Public, Sally Q. Public, the amount of people that are interested, whether they are investors, whether they are owners, whether they are government regulators, whether they are our kids who are getting older, to the person, there's been only a handful, and I do mean a handful, of people that said, nah, it's less relevant today than it was before. The screaming majority of people that have come on the program have said that what we're talking about is more germane, more relevant to them, and that the pace of that is picking up. And so I think that the conversation is relevant. I think it's fascinating. I think we need to all do more. It's a whole other conversation. But the fact that we're having the conversation is where it starts. Education, information, verifiable information that, whether you believe, we are causing climate change or not. I have a point of view there, but that's less relevant. What's relevant is when you track the number of weather-related events in the last 5 years, it's markedly up, and the amount of dangerous impact has gone up from it used to be very rare to have $1 billion event. We now have $10 billion events, and we have 10 of them in the United States a year. And so that's objective data. That's not me or you putting that out there. That's an insurance company saying, here's the impact that we've had to these assets. And so the takeaway is more people are paying attention, more people care. I think more owners, more investors, more regulatory pressure, the SEC, is being put to bear on the topic. And so that will just continue that cycle of folks paying attention. And I think more and more over time are going to be paying attention and asking for this kind of information and demanding it. And so, bringing it to your audience is important so that they can get prepared for how do I present this and what do I have to say and, what's there. Because it's going to take a little bit of time to unpack that. But the small, medium companies shouldn't be put out to pasture because they don't understand it right now. They need to quickly start to understand it and be prepared to report on it. Because I think more and more people are going to be asking about that.
So, Brad, thank you very much for spending time with us. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you, pal.